And good afternoon from Philadelphia. Frank here with another episode of UFO News Network Sunday. And today we've got a couple of very special guests to talk all about UFOs past and maybe a little bit about the present and possibly even the future. You just never know. And let me bring on my co-host today, Chant Hanna, to introduce our very first special guest. Good afternoon, Chant.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I really appreciate that introduction. We have a wonderful person who is an icon in the UFO community. He's a well-known researcher and historian, various topics that we're going to discuss on the show. It is Jan Aldrich. He is a former Master Sergeant, retired 25 plus years at the U.S. Army, and he now resides in Connecticut. He received a BA in history from the University of Maryland, and Aldrich retired from the U.S. Army with a field and artillery, 7 overseas tours. He has had 16 years experience in meteorology, with the remaining time in intelligence, personnel, and safety positions. In spite of his many overseas assignments, plus the continental U.S., Jan has had no significant UFO personal experiences. And since 95, Jan has worked full-time on Project 1947. This is a research effort funded by QFOS, FUFOR, and MUFON, now called the UFO Research Coalition. He has visited over 150 libraries, universities, archives, museums, and historical societies in 46 states and Canadian provinces. Jan delved into MUFON UFO files when he visited Sequin, Texas, former location of the MUFON headquarters. Over 300 contributors worldwide have submitted over 10,000 pages of personal accounts, newspaper clippings, reports, and government documents to Project 1947. In 1996, with the assistance of America Online and other researchers, he created a private email computer network, the Project 1947 email research list, to share and encourage serious UFO researchers worldwide. Project 1947 continues and welcomes further contributions in the collection, research and analysis of pre-47, 1947, and early UFO era material. And really, I could go on about Project 1947. We will be asking him about this in a moment, but I'd like to paint the era of the pre-1947 research area that Jan has been working so hard on. In 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. World War II begins. In 41, regular commercial television broadcasting begins. CBS and NBC television networks launched. In 45, President Roosevelt begins a 4th term. He dies. Truman becomes president, and he becomes the 33rd president of the United States. President Truman did. In 46, the U.S. Atomic Energy Act of 46 occurred, and that determined how the U.S. would control and manage nuclear technology. And then it goes on regarding Robert Goddard. He was an American engineer, professor, and physicist. He died in 1945. In 1945, World War II ended. In 44, V-2 rockets began falling on Britain. In 45, the nuclear atomic bomb is perfected in the U.S., tested in New Mexico. 46, we had ghost rockets that occurred. Ghost rockets is a name given to mysterious rocket or missile-shaped objects, which were sighted on many different occasions between May and December of 46, with peaks on the 9th and 11th of August in 46. They were seen primarily in Sweden and nearby Scandinavian countries. I will be asking Jan a little bit about that to see if he has any information on that topic. In early July, the alleged and disputed Roswell UFO incident occurred, which we'll, of course, be going over that with Jan and Paul Dean later on into the show. And September 18th of 47, the CIA officially comes into existence. In 47, power was finally transferred and India was declared a free nation. Then we had some interesting TV shows that were on. That was Dragnet, Miracle on 34th Street was a great movie. And then we also had, in 47, an X-1 rocket plane piloted by Chuck Yeager, which broke the sound barrier. 47 was a really interesting year, Jan. You started Project 1947. Can you tell us why you started Project 1947, which focuses in on pre-1947 era and 1947.
Okay, when in '93, when I came back from Germany after my last tour, I was looking for something to do, and about that time, the UFO Research Coalition was formed, and I made contact with Don Berliner, and I said, I asked him about Ted Blocher, who had, in the 60s, as part of his employment, he was in a Broadway show that was touring the country. He would go around to various libraries and go through 1947 newspapers, because the era was not well documented. And so he went to, he went through 160, and then after his book, he went through more. So with 168 newspapers, he found over 850 sightings, which he documented in his book about the 1947 wave. I didn't hear about it till almost the end, and I tried to help him by finding things in local newspapers, and whenever I went anywhere. After the book was out, he made the total well over 1,000. I said, this is an almost completely unknown era. I mean, they know, but we know about 3 or 4 incidents that's in every UFO book, but the actual extent and also the type of sightings that were happening are unknown. Everybody always tells me, oh, well, 1947, we're talking about sightings that are way off in the distance, and not true at all. So I when I talked to Don Berliner, I asked him if anybody had kept Ted's research up, and he said no. And I said, well, I'd like to continue it. And he says, there's nothing more to find. Ted found everything. Okay, that's a challenge. Don't tell me that. I'm always contrary. So I said,
that's never the case. There's always something new that escaped somebody.
Right. So I said, okay, I want to continue this project. And then Don told me, well, there might be some money, and he explained about the UFO coalition, which was MUFON, FUFOR, and KUFOS got together, and Robert Bigelow was offering some money at the time. It hadn't been finalized. I said, look, I'm going out to the West Coast, and I'll be going up to the Northwest where the whole thing started. So I went up to Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. I went to the universities, main universities. There was something at the time. It's continued for years now. It's the National Newspaper Project. Excuse me. That's going to happen a couple of times. It's a cancer cough. It's from. I had an operation, so maybe I'll sound like I'm eating something. No, I'm taking a cough.
No worries. No worries.
Medicine. Okay, so like the University of Idaho was the main university in Idaho, or the main entity in Idaho that was collecting newspapers. So I went there and started going through Idaho newspapers that Ted hadn't touched, and things were coming out.
Yeah,
Right
just to jump in here really quick, Jan. It's been a long time, probably, excuse me, the better part of 40 years since I was going around and spelunking around in old newspapers and just looking for this and that, on microfilm. I'm assuming most of these are on microfilm. Really, I mean, how do you... is this material indexed in any way, or do you literally have to go through page by page by page looking for UFO sightings? It sounds like it's potentially some pretty tedious work.
Yeah, it's grunt work. At the time, it was grunt work because you had you didn't have microfilm all the time. You had some microfilm. Sometimes you had to go through newspaper after newspaper, turn page after page. Now you can do all this research online. So compared to the amount of money I spent going to all these all these places all over the country and in Canada. You could do that from your computer now, but you couldn't then, and nothing had. Not actually correct. Most newspapers had not been indexed. A few had, and that was helpful. The newspaper collections were smaller then too, because now they're putting them online, and it's commercial operation, and they're constantly adding to the newspapers. But at the time, during the time I was traveling around the country, myself and others that were aiding me went through 4,000 newspapers, and then about another, I'd say 600 overseas newspapers. Like I say, today it's much easier because they have this online. You can do this research, and we've continued this research. Barry Greenwood's the main one, and he's done thousands of newspapers, and he's not just concentrating on 1947 like I was. Although I did dip into other newspapers at other times. I used to go 19.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I used to go 1947. Then I looked for anything in the 1957 wave, and maybe 1950. But I was a coward. I didn't want to look at 52. I had an idea about how 52 is. 47 was a giant wave. I don't think most people in ufology do not understand what a big wave it was. So we found almost 3,000 items on UFOs. Some of them are humorous or political cartoons or things like that. But as far as sightings, it's way over 1,500.
If I can jump in with a quick question here. Sure. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of, obviously, articles about the UFOs. The attention has really picked up. but we also saw a fair number of editorials as well. Did you come across any editorials related to the waves, whether it was 47 or 57 or whatever you looked at? Did you come across any kind of editorial articles about the UFO subject? And if you did, what was the general take on it all?
Well, in 47, it was. There were of course the old ideas that it's a big joke and it's a summer silly season. Remember, this is after the war too. People are trying to get back to normal life, and humor is a kind of a thing that's going on about that time. So you had some material like that. You had other people that were warning this might be Russians. 1947, not too many people were thinking about outer space as a place which these things could come from, except they thought they might be meteors. The first Gallup poll was taken in August. The recognition of flying saucers, the name, was in the high 90s. And so almost everybody in America had heard about them. And then later on, of course, the spectrum goes all the way from serious and why aren't we doing something about this and let's look into this, to the idea that, it's silly season again, the nuts are out. Here we're having more of these things reported, and it's obvious that these people are publicity seekers or other things like that. So we had kind of a...
I do know that the Arnold case was Kenneth Arnold case was a very famous case from 1947, and I don't know if it was immediately afterwards or a few months afterwards, maybe 48, 49, whatever the case may be. Edward R. Murrow had done an interview with him, and do you get the sense that helped any in terms of taking the subject matter seriously?
Some people did. I mean, the Air Force definitely did. The Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the Air Materiel Command. This is an interesting 1946 letter, or letters, between General LeMay, who at the time was in charge of research and development, and the Secretary of the Air Force. And the Secretary of the Air Force asked LeMay, he says, what happens if you have a project, something that happens between budgets? And LeMay said, well, look, here's what happens if the commander of AMC decides that there's a necessity for some kind of project between budgets. He has the right to do a interim project, and but the next budget he has to go ahead and justify putting it in the next budget. But he has the authority to do an interim project. That's exactly what happened. The aviation editor at the Boise Statesman newspaper, who had interviewed Arnold very early on, the 3rd of July, 1947, Arnold's sighting was on the 24th. So on the 3rd of July, just before the July 4th weekend, he called General Twining at Air Materials Command, and he told General Twining, he said, there's something to this UFO stuff. He says, I've got 5 cases here that I've looked into as part of the journalistics investigation I'm doing. So LeMay wrote a little memo. It's on Project 47. He wrote a little memo to his second, General Brett Nell, who was in charge of engineering at Wright-Patterson. He wrote, the memo said, we're going to look into this flying saucer thing. So get ready. And so almost right after the 4th of July weekend, AMC was already looking into this. Now, he didn't need to go to the Pentagon and get permission. He could do it on his own authority, and that's what he did. Later on, they did go to Vandenberg, the vice commander of the Air Force, or vice chief of staff of the Air Force, and told them what he had done. They were already, at the Pentagon, they were already thinking about having such a project anyways. So the officials took it seriously from the beginning, even though the public relations people spent a lot of time poo-pooing the whole business. So it's kind of interesting, and finding that letter that told how an interim project could be initiated was very fortunate.
Was that project, was that sign or grudge, or
no? It wasn't signed yet.
Okay.
It wasn't signed, but they started looking into this almost immediately. The engineer section was up there, was the one that was doing it at first, and I've got a few of General Brett Nell's letters where he's thanking people for sending in UFO reports. But later it transferred over to intelligence up there.
You're talking about
yet.
Okay, yeah, you're talking about ATIC now, Air Technical Intelligence Center.
Well, no, at the time it was called T2.
Okay.
Colonel McCoy was in charge of it, and his title was Deputy Commanding General for Air Materials Center Intelligence. So he was in charge of intelligence, and his position was a general's position, even though he was a colonel, which meant something later when people were dealing with him. I mean, he was only a colonel, but he had the ear of General Twining, who was a lieutenant general. So the head of Air Force Intelligence was a major general. So you can see the dynamics there.
Mm-hmm. And they were on this before the Arnold case, because that was the case that really got a lot of attention.
They weren't on it before the Arnold case.
They weren't, you're saying?
Shortly afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, Arnold's June 24, and Twining's memo to Brett Nell is 3 July, just before.
Okay.
Yeah, so just before the 4th of July.
Because that case was really a turning point, at least looking back from today. That case was a real turning point in terms of at least the public consciousness regarding UFOs. After that case, it really got a lot more attention, and something about Arnold, that he was regarded as a credible guy, and he became kind of the first sort of private ufologist himself after that.
Yes, he did. He did investigations. In fact, he even got a letter from 4th Air Force, saying that it was okay for him to do investigations. He kind of hyped it up a little bit, but yeah, essentially they let him get involved officially, and still into 1967 he did investigation and sent it into the Idaho National Air Guard, which we can't find. It's not in the Blue Book files. So, but the newspaper said that he went and did this CE1 case. So, yeah, he stayed active for quite a while.
Yeah, and he developed a really good relationship with the Air Force. The two officers who interviewed him initially, they kind of vouched for his credibility, and that went, I think, probably a long way towards adding some credibility to his sighting. And also after, and I don't know, I'm guessing it's in the time frame, so I'm guessing you know a little bit about that. The two officers who interviewed him, Arnold sort of called them in when there was a case in Maury Island, not too long after his own sighting, that he went down and investigated, and he also called them in. There were allegedly some fragments from the UFO that was sighted they took possession of. And can you talk a little bit about that case? Because I'm not sure it's not necessarily an ET UFO case, but it ended pretty badly for the Air Force guys involved. Some folks might not be familiar with that.
They were killed in a crash. And of course, then when you have conspiracy theories, you could say, well, the UFO destroyed the plane, which is not the case. I've read the accident report. It was the aircraft was defective, but these were remember, the Air Force in early '47 is still part of the Army. It's the Army Air Force. So the two officers that went up there were in the counterintelligence corps. Brown, and I forget what the other guy's name was. They went up and interviewed Arnold. They looked at some of the letters that he had got. He had got about, during the first, as soon as he hit the newspapers, people started sending him letters. Some of them were just theories or questions or things like that, but a lot of people just told him their sightings. Unfortunately, Arnold didn't hold on to these almost 6,000 letters. He sent them to Ray Palmer, who sent them back, and they're destroyed. Unfortunately, that would be a treasure trove of stuff.
And just to jump in, didn't Palmer publish Fate magazine? Was that the one that he published?
Yes, he was the publisher of Fate magazine. So the Maury Island story got in there, and a few other places. Now the FBI did an investigation of Maury Island. It's in the 4th Air Force files. Usually when people look at the Maury Island thing, they just throw up their hands because the FBI has crossed out all the names, so it's hard to tell who did what to whom. So most people don't even look at that. Most writers haven't looked at it. But in the 4th Air Force files, which is headquartered in, and that's where the two officers came from that investigated it. 4th Air Force file has the FBI investigation without the names being redacted. The witnesses were kind of flaky, to say the least. the FBI is talking about one of the so-called witnesses, and one of his relatives comes out with a knife and holds it to the guy's. It wasn't Chrisman; it was the other fellow, and says, "Now you just admit man that you're lying. All this is all this is just we made this up." So that's in the FBI files. You can find it there. Like I said, the best copy of that thing is in the 4th Air Force files. They did look at the material that was on the plane that the agents had when they crashed. Then there's something that happened that affected the whole UFO situation. Colonel Springer, who was the intelligence officer at 4th Air Force, who had sent those 2 officers up there to investigate, he said, "We're through investigating." Now, the reporter that heard that, I mean, he had like a mini press conference at his headquarters. When Springer said, "We're through investigating," he interpreted that Springer was talking about the Air Force. And so worldwide on the newswire, it said that the Air Force is through investigating flying saucers in August of 1947. So from the 3rd of July to about the 10th of August, the public thought that there was an investigation. It was announced that they were investigating. However, on the 10th of August, Springer's little press conference gave everybody the impression all over the world. I mean, I found stories in India that says the U.S. Air Force has stopped investigating UFOs, or they call at the time the UFO hadn't been coined really. Some people used it. I mean, Ruppelt says he investigated UFO. He coined the term UFO, but the term unidentified flying objects had been used before Ruppelt came on the scene. Had been used on the 3rd of July in a Canadian Air Force letter. So he didn't really coin the term, but he coined the abbreviation, I guess.
Got it. Got it.
Anyways, it's kind of getting away from the whole 47 wave. This is Maury Island. I think is a hoax. I think most people believe that. There's a minority that don't, and Jacques Vallée is one of the people.
Getting back,
he thinks there might be something to it.
Yeah, getting back to Arnold, he, a lot of people came his way. Pilots came his way. You can see that in some of his public statements, he's referring back to what I think we know now is Foo Fighters. Apparently, some World War II vets had contacted him saying they had seen things. So he became a pretty big deal. Back in those days, he was kind of the man as far as UFOs were concerned in this time frame.
Right. Yeah. The like I say, Don Johnson is the one that kicked the whole ball off with General Twining on the investigations, and he was a pretty big deal at the time. The Air Force finally told Johnson to shut up because Johnson was in the Idaho Air National Guard. He went out himself, Johnson did. I think it was on, it was the 9th and 10th and 11th, he went out himself in an Idaho National Guard plane, looking for UFOs as a part of his editor sent him out, and he filmed the UFO. It wasn't a very good film, but it's in Project Blue Book. Arnold, you're right. He spoke all around the country. He was on TV. He was on the radio, and he was a big deal. And like you said, yeah, people sent him all kinds of accounts. Like I said, most of them don't survive, unfortunately. Right after his sighting, which went worldwide, as a matter of fact, he, not only him, but the local newspapers, veterans were coming forward from the Second World War talking about Foo Fighters. So there were a number of those things. I found quite a few of them. Not only pilots in the air, but people on the ground saw them in Europe and in the Pacific and several other places. And of course, there's some Navy sightings too that came up in the newspapers. It was, and then just before 47, in 1946, newspapers were full of ghost rockets. There's another phenomena. So the thing about the 1947 wave is at least I could say this in 1995, every known UFO activity that we had on record, almost all of them took place in 1947 too. That's close approaches, interference with radios, buzzing aircraft, following cars, all and even occupant cases. All these things happened in 1947. I mean, it's not an evolving phenomena. It's from the very start, many of these things were happening right during the 1947 wave.
And looking at your outline for different goals you've got regarding Project 1947, I see a couple paragraphs devoted to early close encounters. Those types of cases, according to what I'm reading here from Ruppelt and Kehoe, were very skeptical. Apparently did not follow up on them any at all, really. But there are a number of cases like that. You were kind of alluding to them, which is why I brought it up. Any particular case that really stands out from that time frame regarding, extra close encounters?
Okay, it's 1952 in September. Ruppelt's going down there to look at the Scoutmaster case, which is kind of famous. He's going down there to look at that case, and I don't understand why he did not know about or look at other cases down there that were happening at the same time. Florida has the Everglades experimental agricultural institute down there. Farmer Brown had he worked for them. He had a herd of cows, and he was getting ready to bring them in for milking. And this red UFO came very close to him. In fact, he smelled some kind of acidic odor associated with the UFO. But it chased his cows over the all over the pastures there, and when he got them in, the milk content that that he got from them it had decreased for a number of days afterwards. About 2 weeks later, at the same place, a number of the scientists and their wives were at the facility later on. This is, like I say, 2 weeks later. It's foggy. It's in the morning, and they have a close encounter. That's two one right after the other. I always thought that Ruppelt had influenced Keel. Apparently, it's sort of the other way around, or they influenced both on close encounter cases. Ruppelt has a list of close encounter cases in his personal papers, and he's talking about Abdamski, the Scoutmaster case, and a couple other contactees, and he says this is just junk. And anyways, the policy was to, if we got any such cases, we threw them away.
Yeah, I remember in his book, I don't recall any kind of mention of any of those types of cases in his book.
Yeah, he does say our policy was to throw them in the trash, which is unfortunate. They don't. There are some in the early Blue Book, but they're. Keogh belonged to or wrote for True Magazine. And True Magazine had done 2 exposés about the Scully story, and so
and that was about the New Mexico crash flying saucer. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly what it was about. And they had done 2 exposés, so I think Keogh knew that True was not. They were not happy about this, so he didn't look into those until much later. I don't think he was really convinced until the 1957. However, now we're talking early days, about 52 or so. Bill Nash, he and another. Bill Nash was a pilot for Pan American Airways, and he had a spectacular UFO sighting in 52. He and an industrialist who had film cameras and recording material went out and interviewed Farmer Brown in 1954. Brown said he had reported, and of course in the newspapers it said this too. Brown said he had reported it to the local civil defense, and it shows the local police and the mayor standing with Farmer Brown and talking about his case. But when Nash went out there, he said, Brown told him, he said, I've also been questioned by naval intelligence and Air Force intelligence. And of course, we can't find anything in the Project Blue Book files. Nash wrote to Captain Bob White, who is the Pentagon spokesman, and he says, we don't have anything on this case. So it's, I mean, the government doesn't do themselves any service at all, because they apparently the right hand never knows what the left hand is doing.
We're still getting a little bit of that today. Nothing's changed.
Yeah, I know. It is. So they doesn't any service. So it, and of course, there's people inside the government that disagree with the policy. So Captain Bob White was the Pentagon spokesman, but he was a good friend of Keogh's, and he used to slip Keogh things under the table. Keogh had a lot of internal people that were constantly giving him hints or actually sending him UFO reports, official UFO reports from, remember, nobody could get to Project Blue Book until way into the 70s, and it was hard. You had to go to Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And they finally moved them up to the National Archives in Washington, but it was either impossible to get it because the Air Force wouldn't let anybody see them. There's about, I think Quintanilla has a list of about 20 people that got to look at the Blue Book files when Blue Book was operating, or at least when they were when he was in charge. So there were some newsmen that got to go there, but they were always writing what the Air Force wanted them to write, like Sidney Shelton.
Now, you had mentioned another writer, Frank Scully, briefly. And Scully's kind of an interesting guy because if you ask people these days, what's the most famous case from back in those days, the late 40s, maybe, let's say during the Truman administration era, they would tell you the Roswell case. And here's Scully writing about dead extraterrestrial beings recovered from a crashed flying saucer in New Mexico. Here he's doing it, back in that time frame, and as far as I know, he's about the only guy who's doing this. Can you tell us a little bit about Frank Scully, and what do you make of his writing and his work?
Well, Scully was a writer. He wrote a lot for Variety. He wrote on movie criticism, really. He was an interesting character. He always had a lot of people in his home visiting and things from all over the place. Roswell was covered in the newspapers the 9th and 10th of July, and that was about the end of the 47 wave. The newspapers nationally stopped carrying stories after Roswell. They would carry overseas stories and humorous stories, but most UFO cases only got regional coverage after that. National coverage, like I said, was only for overseas debunking stories and humor. So Roswell did hit the papers, and some people did know, even though it was supposedly debunked, the press conference at 8th Air Force, we found a thesis that was written in 48, and this guy is talking about in his college thesis about Roswell and how he thinks it's important. So some people kept it alive, but not too many. Scully's thing was a crash saucer. Of course, it's got all kinds of fantastic things that probably can't be that. We don't think that extraterrestrials would use inches. Everything on Scully's saucer was 9 inches, or multiples of 9, or parts of 9 inches. It was like the extraterrestrial foot or something. He said that the powerful radars in New Mexico brought down the saucer.
Okay.
This is funny because this is the beginning of the radar era. They do have some better than normal radars at White Sands. They do have those, definitely, but as far as being powerful, they're pretty primitive, actually, radars at the time. Just after World War II, so the ones at White Sands had been modified, so they were better than most radars around. But as far as being powerful enough to interfere with, if you got extraterrestrials that got here, I don't think they're going to be crashing because of lightning strikes or 1947 radar transmissions. I don't think they're going to be crashed. But that was Scully's thesis. The Air Force didn't like that, of course, and like I said, Keogh's magazine wrote 2 exposés about Scully. The guys that started the stories, which they were based on, were, you could say, oil prospectors. You can probably put that in quotation marks. They were more like con men. One of them, I guess, served some time in jail.
Yeah, I think I know who you're talking about. I can't think of the guy's name off the top of my head.
Kind of questionable characters. I don't know if Scully had run into some of the stuff that had happened in Roswell and used that in his book. That's why I asked Don Berliner when I talked to him after returning from overseas. I said, "Well, Scully's story has got some credence to it." He says, No. He says Roswell's different.
And what do you think of the Roswell case in general? Do you think it's possible that an ET craft did crash out that way and they found it, or?
Well, I have a Roswell page on my on Project 47 because you can't talk about the 47 wave. Although that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to talk about the 1947 wave without getting into Roswell.
Right.
because everybody's doing. These people that have never been to Roswell, they're calling me up and say, "I'm a Roswell researcher." I said, "Oh, have you been down there to look at the place?" He says, No. We're up here in Kentucky. We haven't been down there yet." I'm saying, you guys are Roswell researchers, huh? So, it's like I said, it's the end of the 1947 wave as far as national press coverage goes. So it's significant historically. What I did is I put everything I could find on Roswell and places that I had looked at in the National Archives and other places, which might have some information on Roswell as far as official stuff. I put that in my in Project 1947, and then I listed a whole bunch of possible sources that people should check, or things that were in the Air Force's report that people should double check. Quite frankly, I've never heard anybody taking my advice on any of that stuff. So, but no, I hadn't done that much Roswell research. I mean, I found a copy of the Roswell newspaper, not the Roswell, the Roswell Air Base newspaper for the 10th of July. It just mentions that, well, it's not the 10th of July, it's after the 10th of July, but it mentions that there was a whole bunch of newspaper interest. It doesn't go into the case at all. I did go and look in the Fort Worth newspaper, And what was interesting is when they had the news conference in Ramey's office, the 8th Air Force intelligence officer was not present, and the assistant intelligence officer was the officer of the day that day. So he was not in his office either. That's kind of seemed to me unusual. So that's about all I found by research on this case. Like I said, I was specifically trying to avoid getting embroiled in Roswell.
Understood.
But, yeah. Because there were more than enough people looking at it.
Sure.
I wanted to look at the whole panoply of the 1947 wave. Now, with, like I said, the newspapers nationally stopped carrying stories, but there were still plenty of stories, but they're mostly regional or local. And Blocher when he had screened newspapers as he was going around the country, he stopped at the 10th of July. I tried to screen all newspapers at least to the 15th of July. And then if they were out west, I tried to go to the end of July. And then also some of the ones where there were UFO activities, I screened all the way to the end of 1947. But that wasn't very many of them. Of course, today we could do a better job.
Oh, that's wonderful.
You can use search terms. You can use search terms on a computer. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for all that wonderful information you just shared. I wanted to go ahead and welcome Paul Dean onto our show. And let me just go ahead and share a little bit about Paul Dean. He's an icon in the UFO community. He is an Australian researcher who focuses on government and military involvement and response to the so-called UFO phenomena. Working alone for 20 years, Paul became an expert in regards to so-called UFO files. 6 years ago, he began tackling the problem directly and became instrumental in seeing that the Australian government release classified files from the Royal Australian Air Force, Air Services Australia, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, and the National Archives of Australia. He works extensively with Australian-based researcher Keith Fasterfield on UFO case analysis and preservation of UFO-related records. He also works with Jan Aldrich on a project that he's going to go over with us. And just wanted to welcome Paul on the show. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
Hi, how's it going?
Great. Yeah, Paul, you've been on the show with us multiple times. We actually had you on a really great show. It was a review of 2019 most recently. And I wanted to ask you, actually I had a lot of questions to ask you, but I wanted to kind of paint a background regarding the pre-1947 and 1947 era, which I did for Jan, but I just wanted to remind our listeners of the era that we're talking about. And that is in 45, World War II ended. Then we also had some really interesting things going on in that era. And that was Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier with the X-1 rocket plane. And then we also had Polaroid camera was invented in 1947. Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in baseball. In 47, the Studebaker became the first automobile manufacturer to introduce a post-war model. And also we had some other interesting things happen. Just trivia. First broadcast of Meet the Press. The World Series is broadcast live on television for the first time. And George Orwell was frantically writing 1984 from his sickbed. Wanted to ask you about the 1947 project you are working on with Jan. Can you share a little bit about that project with us, Paul?
Yeah, sure. So let me explain something. Hi, Jan, by the way. Jan, I should just say Jan is one of the sort of work I do is a sort of so what Jan does is essentially what I do, but the thing is Jan's been at it for about 40 years, whereas I've been, at it for, like at only 20% of that time. So people like Jan and I work very well together. But what I think you mean is I'll start with this. Down in Alabama, there's a place called Maxwell Air Force Base, and it houses a command called the Air Force Research and Historical Agency, and it does everything from preserving Air Force material to assessing old Air Force files for release to the public, oral history interviews with former commanders or rank officers. They allow so through there's a system there. You'd call it an online system, I suppose, but it does have people on the other end of it. It's called the Air Force the Air Force History Index, and what it is, the Air Force History Index is an online database of holdings that are Air Force Research Historical Agency actual number, and what they hold is documents called things like unit histories, base histories, command chronologies, various special studies. They could be special war studies or special battle studies or flight regime studies, technical reports, other sort of historical preservation information like correspondence letters between, say, the Air Force and the other commands like the Army, the Marines, documents relating to the Air Force's role in the space race, and so on. And when I think it was Jan first, look, if it wasn't Jan, it was someone only slightly earlier than Jan. When Jan and the great archivist Barry Greenwood in Boston, when they cottoned onto this Air Force History Index, a database of documents, what they found instantaneously, this would have been 4 years ago, they found instantaneously that when you do keyword searches in the descript abstract section of each document, they're finding the word UFO or unknown incident or whatever over and over and over again. And more importantly, they're finding that there's other documents that should or could relate to the UFO matter, such as oral histories with brigadier generals, various pieces of doctrine that deal with the stray aircraft or unknown aircraft, and one particularly important type of document that is totally overlooked in the historical UFO field it's overlooked by the average UFO buff, is a pair of types of documents called unit histories or base histories. Now, a unit in the United States Air Force, a unit is like a squadron or a parent organization like a wing, a wing, or their parent organisation, which are groups, and their parent organisations, which are air divisions or major commands. So for those in the Army, you would know it going up from the bottom as battalion, brigade, division, corps. In the Navy, it'd be something like task force, flotilla, armada, fleet. So a squadron history is a unit history, a wing history is a unit history, whatever. Then there's base history. So over the years, I think the United States, just on continental United States alone, has had something like 120 Air Force bases and Air Force stations in the last sort of 70 years, dating back to the time period that you're talking about, say 1945 or whatever. And anyway, so each year, by clockwork, squadrons and wings and groups produce unit histories and bases produce base histories. They're done by the base executive officer or the base historian or the chief of operations or the chief of sort of internal affairs or whatever. And lo and behold, if you go back to the 1940 era, 1941 through, and you can pick any year, 1965, 1973, whatever, you will see references to UFOs. I mean, you can go to a unit hit. Now, what a unit history contains is a year-long history of the unit. So it could be, I don't know, the 406th Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron or the 1024th Airborne Refueling Wing Unit or the 26th Fighter Command or whatever. And you or it could be a base, it could be McCord Air Force base history, or Griffiths Air Force base history. They're always over 12-month or 6-month periods published, and they can be hundreds of pages long each. Anyway, you'll go through, and there's different chapters on awards given to personnel or visiting staff, or fuel requirements, financial requirements, electricity requirements of the base or the unit, and in there, time and time again, it seems every single time we have the Air Force Historical Research Agency release a unit history to us. It could be a unit history for some squadron that hasn't been around for 50 years, that nobody can barely even remember. And sure enough, there is sometimes pages of UFO sightings. Sometimes, there'll be a chapter called Intelligence and Security Incidences, and in there there will be actually a category called UFO sightings, as if it's normal. Yeah, wow.
That is fascinating, and I also wanted to bring up something that we had talked about a little bit previous to the show, and that is a really interesting topic about Barry Greenwood may have found investigation files which linked plane crashes to UFOs. Can you touch on that topic?
Absolutely. Back in 1984, Barry Greenwood produced. Basically, Barry Greenwood is a famous Freedom of Information Act user and abuser from the 70s and 80s. He worked with an even more prolific FOI by the name of Robert Todd, and Lawrence Fawcett, another one. To a lesser extent, Larry Bryant, Todd Zeckel, Brad Sparks, and basically between probably about 1974 and really into the 90s, Barry and these guys submitted, we think, especially Robert Todd, submitted some 4,000 FOI requests to the US government, whether it be to Army battalions or naval task forces or Air Force squadrons, to the CIA, DIA, NIA, the whole lot. And by 1984, Barry and Lawrence Fawcett and Robert Todd and so on had amassed so many documents that had been written and released after Project Blue Book had finished, after the so-called Condon Report, after the US government was supposedly not interested, not investigating, not taking reports, not studying UFOs. Anyway, one of the more obscure things that Barry found was that there's back in the really in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s, there was a command known as the Air Force. I'm just look if it was Air Force Safety Inspection Center or no. Yeah, it was Air Force Inspection and Safety Center, and it was based at Norton Air Force Base. And what the Air Force Inspection and Safety Centre did, they analysed significant plane crashes, near mid-air collisions, failings on helicopters and planes, the use of safety equipment from fire hydrants right up through to complex avionics systems. They were your safety and flight safety and airworthiness section for the whole United States Air Force. Some 5,000 staff at any one time. Anyway, now they're actually just simply called the Air Force Safety Centre, and it's moved to Kirkland Air Force Base. But be that as it may, Barry found that he actually sent freedom. Barry found that there was obviously over the years there's been a number of cases where planes have crashed, disappeared. They've had to do emergency landings and crashed upon landings, and he took the step of actually asking the Air Force Inspection and Safety Centre where we knew there were cases where a plane had crashed and there'd been rumours of UFOs or rumours of another weird aircraft up there, or we had copies of the pilot's conversation with air traffic control and he mentions another aircraft, whatever. Barry actually asked for those particular files, and there was 3 or 4 of them, and sure enough, every one of them contained significant information about at least the possibility that the pilot was stuck up there with a UFO. And in his famous, so Barry found that by 1983 he had so many documents that him and Lawrence Fawcett simply were forced to write a book about it, and the book is called Clear Intent. It was published again in the 90s as the UFO Cover-Up, What the Government Won't Say. But let's go back. So clear intent, page 61 has a section. I want to read this. So this is Barry writing. UFO jet chases and crashes are not new. A number of incidences have occurred over the years by using the Freedom of Information Act, chased jet reports involving UFOs have been made public. Military-orientated aircraft accident reports are now on file at the Air Force Inspection and Safety Center at Norton Air Force Base in California. Release of information is subject to the guidelines and restrictions of the Freedom of Information Act so that only portions of the reports can be made public. Perhaps the most important part of any accident report is the Board of Investigation proceedings. This gives the full details of the circumstances surrounding the cause of a crash. In probing the crash files, we have not received one single Board of Investigation proceeding of any crash report to date. The reason being is that the Freedom of Information Act allows an agency to protect internal decision making and in the case of crash reports to protect the methods used for investigation. This is most convenient for the Air Force and most inconvenient for us trying to obtain the facts behind UFO and jet incidences. Some revealing things have surfaced though. So what he's saying is he's had 3 or 4 files released from this centre, but the most important part of the file, which is the Board of Proceedings section, has never been released in any of them. So his UFO information that have come from these cases has come from other sections within the files, like the conclusions, the recommendations, the introductions, the contents pages, and so on. So this is a whole area of UFO history that we know virtually nothing about.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask you. Actually, I have a few questions to ask you, but I'll go ahead and go with this one, and then I have another one right after that. Regarding the unit history and the base histories that you went over so well, regarding the definition of them, what I wanted to know is the unit and the base histories. Did you find, or did any researchers find, any anecdotal information located in those histories other than clinical data?
What do you mean clinical data?
Okay. Yes, sure. I can explain. Thank you for your question. Other than dry data, was there ever any colorful sounding or personal or anecdotal sounding information that was shared regarding any of the dry data in the unit or base histories?
Yes.
Yeah?
What was
I can answer that. Well, it's things like, 1980. This is post Blue Book, so 1980 in England. It's a near miss report. That's the thing when you go to Maxwell Air Force Base. Early stuff that was there before the 1960s or 70s was not indexed for UFOs or flying saucers or flying discs. Now, some indexers took it on their own to index these things, but it wasn't policy. After, I guess, in the 90s or so, they started indexing for UFOs. So what you have to do if you go to Maxwell Air Force Base, a lot of cases it's just what's a likely unit that would have a UFO case and look it up. They're very helpful at Maxwell, but they have limited staff. But what I wanted to comment on was what Paul said about the accidents. Recently, a lot of accident reports have been released to the National Archives. The Maxwell and the National Archives and the Air Force Academy are fighting over records. They all want stuff for their libraries. So you have to visit all these places to get stuff. Plus, places like St. Louis, the archives, the branch archives in St. Louis, they won't let you in there. You can't see what's in there. And the Air Force Air Defense records are there. But talking about the accidents. Some of these are now at the National Archives. I got the one for Kinross. And no, I didn't get the one for Kinross. I got the one for upstate New York.
Wylesville, yeah.
So it says, this is interesting because this stuff is obscured in the actual official report. It says the aircraft was on a practice mission that was changed to an air defense mission. In other words, this is something real that they have to go and look and find what it was.
Okay, I wanted to go.
It doesn't state the why it was changed, what they were looking for. It just says it's changed to an air defense mission.
Yeah.
Then it says in there, the engine light came on, indicating a fire. And this is what they're trying to tell the public. Okay, this red light came on my my dashboard, and we punched out. We punched out. In other words, we ejected from the aircraft, and the aircraft crashed into a residential area, killing people. Now, that's mostly when you read Air Force pilots, when they encounter some kind of problem, they try to get the aircraft away from residential areas or where there's people. They try to crash somewhere where people won't get hurt if they can. But just because a light came on, they punched out.
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me. That's completely bollocks.
That is fascinating. Yeah. I wanted to bring up a topic that Frank brought up earlier, Jan and Paul, and that is Frank had asked Jan if he felt there was any ring of authenticity to the 1947 early July alleged Roswell ET craft, basically. Let's not beat around the bush. There was allegedly an ET craft or crafts that allegedly crashed in Corona, New Mexico. I think it was July 7th, 1947. I wanted to bring up something interesting I found when I was doing research of that era. It's not necessarily directly related by any means, but it's an interesting piece of trivia. I'll lead up to it. First, let me go ahead and share a little bit of background that you all already know, and that is that Winzen Research, WINZEN, Winzen Research, Inc., won a bid to build a balloon for the Air Force, which was part of the Army during that period of time. And apparently, Otto C. Winzen, who was part owner of Winzen Research, his wife Vera owned 2/3 of that company. He told a friend of his, and this leads up to something, so bear with me. He told a friend of his, here's the quote, "Otto then told me that if you hear I died by suicide or accident, it will be neither." In 1979, Otto C. Winzen died from suicide. And I just thought that was interesting because it was allegedly one of his balloons that was used during that crash that happened in 1947, according to the U.S. Air Force. That was his balloon that crashed instead of an ET craft. Do you all have any topics on that anecdotal bit of information right there?
I don't think his company was involved in Roswell.
Okay.
At that time, as the University of New York, and there were several other subcontractors. You would not believe the amount of information that I have on that. It's boxes and boxes of what's going on, people's diaries, how they set up for the.
We would have heard about this years and years and years and years and years ago. Like Kevin Randell, Jan, Barry, they've done so much work on Roswell. This is just another sideline story that I think Jan would agree with that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that input. I wanted to know if you all went over a report. Frank, can you share which report that is that you shared underneath the post I did regarding 1947 It was government.
Well, yeah,
records.
that was the Air Force investigation at the behest of then President Bill Clinton regarding Roswell.
Yeah, it was in that report that I saw Winsen Research Inc. Having been possibly involved in that crash. I don't mind being wrong, and I'm glad you corrected me. I know
Well,
you
I'm
know
not
which.
sure.
Okay, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
I'm not sure, but most of the stuff I find here, they're not mentioned.
Okay,
Now,
that's
some of
fascinating.
the principle. I'm doing an outline, somewhat. Let's put it this way: George Eberhardt of CUFOS is doing an outline of UFO history. It runs into hundreds of pages. It's something like
600 pages.
Yeah, Dolan has an outline of UFO history in his first national UFOs and National Security State book.
Okay, I have a question.
But what I'm doing is I'm doing the part before from the 1600s to 1964, and there are so many things about what was going on with the balloons out there at Alamogordo, and I'm using people's diaries and things like that.
Okay, wonderful.
I don't know if it was a balloon or not. I don't know what it is.
Okay. So just had a question, gentlemen, and that is, let's say Winsen, in theory, Winsen Research Inc. Was involved allegedly in an actual balloon crash out there in early July. Would that still be considered? I don't think
they existed at that time. That's what I'm saying. General Mills was doing research with those big balloons. Winsen, I think.
And Winsen got a grant from General Mills, I believe.
They broke off from General Mills later on.
Well, I think Otto C. Winsen actually worked with General Mills regarding his balloons.
Yeah, he did, and he broke off from him, and he did his own company. And
okay.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. Okay, I don't know the history exactly when he broke off.
Okay, well, he left General Mills in 1949 to found Winsen Research Inc. So,
right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, Winsen Research didn't exist yet.
Yeah. Okay, I'm glad you caught that. Very, very good. Okay, so then if people were to do research during that period of time regarding balloons that may have been used in July or during the 1947 period of time, they need to go ahead and find out what companies were involved, and it was not Winsen. Is that right?
Right. University of New York was I think the main contractor there.
Yeah, okay. That's correct.
We interviewed C.B. Moore.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a number of other people involved at General Mills. Of course, C.B. Moore is a skeptic on Roswell.
Okay,
we didn't get into it too much.
So then the question, I go back to, thank you for clarifying all that, by the way, Jan. I just wanted to, and I did actually look up what you were talking about while we were talking, and that's why I was able to confirm that Winsen left General Mills in 49. But anyway, what I was going to ask you is what Frank did, and that is, do you believe, and this question is for Paul as well, do you both believe that there is a ring of authenticity to the possibility that there was some kind of anomalous craft that was not made by the U.S. military or any first world or any other kind of world government on our planet, that there may have been some kind of technology that landed or crashed in Corona, New Mexico in early July 1947?
I don't. It's such a. You've got to remember. It's such a fantastic. The evidence has to be so overwhelming and so compelling. It's such a it's such a fantastic claim. I mean, you're talking about something that will completely rewrite the history of history. I mean, you're actually implying that a creature from another planet, another entity from somewhere else completely, actually was actually physically crashed in the desert in the United States. And I mean, the research just doesn't hold out. I mean, the early investigations into Roswell were poor. The story about bodies only came in much later on. The Mogul balloon flight is very likely responsible. I don't know what Jan thinks on it, but we need far better evidence than that.
Well, I talked to Don Schmidt on this, and Richard Hastings. Now, Randall and Schmidt would call Hastings in during the investigation to look at what they were doing, and Hastings told me, he said, these guys at some time would almost be at each other's throats about whether they should believe one of the witnesses they had or not. He said there was a lot of conflict, and there was some doubt. But when you write the book, when they wrote the book, you don't get anything that deviates from it's a straight story. Now I understand telling about a straight story. But if you have doubts about some witness or some event in the story, I think that should come out, and it didn't. And I asked Don Schmidt about that, and he said, "Yeah, we did. We didn't talk about the conflicts in our books. We just wrote the straight story." So, and remember, these people are talking about things that happened decades ago, and in the book it says at 3:00 this happened. Well, are you sure it's 3:00? And how is that? So I'm sort of an agnostic on Roswell. Like I said, I was involved in meteorology, and some of the stuff that they were doing out at Alamogordo I know about, but I can't talk about it.
Okay, I wanted to ask you a question that I think is important, since you both are veteran researchers of various topics that include not just the UFO topic, but of history. The question I have for both of you is this: what constitutes good data? What constitutes or makes for proof? Scientists still argue regarding the definition of proof to this day. So what is evidence, good data, and proof to both of you?
Jan?
Okay, if you want a good case, look at the Minot case. There's 120 pages of actual transcripts of the pilot and the tower talking to each other. There are interviews that were done by the Air Force and Tom on the ground personnel involved. But then we went back and interviewed everybody, all the living crew of the B-52 case, the B-52 part of the case. Tom went and interviewed the guys on the ground. And then ABC News got involved in the case. And they went and re-interviewed everybody. And when they presented it on the air, that thing had been, the people involved had been interviewed multiple times, and especially with Tom, he had taken all the documents involved in the case and put it with the with the witness statements. And the one thing about the Minot case is they had an out briefing, and one of Tom's questions is the general at the base gave the out briefing. He said, "Did the general tell you that you guys should not discuss this among yourselves?" And the pilot in the Minot case said, "No, he didn't. We didn't need to be told. We knew we weren't supposed to discuss it among ourselves." And they didn't. And so these guys, they were broken up. The crew was broken up afterwards because of the Vietnam War. They were sending some people over, and some people would go to other assignments. These guys, I think only two guys met and maybe mentioned it. Their testimony is uncontaminated by talking to each other at all, and they're telling basically where they were in the aircraft. They're telling their story from their point of view. If you're a radar officer, you're talking about the radar. If you're the pilot, you're talking about what it looked like outside. So I think that's good evidence, because each part of the case, each different testimony or document confirms each other, and it's been multiple investigators have confirmed the thing. So I think that's very good.
Yeah, Jan or Paul, let me jump in here real quick, Jan.
Yeah.
Jan or Paul, can you fill the folks in on the details of the Minot case? I mean, what did these guys see and experience?
Jan, you're better with this one.
Oh boy, this is the skeptics hate this case. They won't go near it. They're scared of it.
Yeah,
they're scared of it. They're dead. Nobody will touch it. No one. And they've said that they're scared of this case. It's in October of '68. It's too late for the Condon report. The B-52, they are not nuclear armed. They're coming off alert. After they've been on alert with nuclear weapons for 30 days. When they come off alert, they go through a check flight. They had one additional member of the crew who was getting his pilot time, so he was on there. It's a regular crew of this aircraft. They were returning to Minot. They had permission to land. Prior to them coming on the scene, people on the ground at the various some of the missile areas there were seeing things, lights, and the B-52 came into the area, and the tower told them, "Go to this position and tell us what you see." I said, "Oh my God." So that's what they're saying.
It sounds a little bit like the Mantell case.
For 48 hours, and they're saying, "Oh my God, do we have to do this?" So so they went to the scene. Something came up on the back of them. So the radar officer and the ELAN officer are the only guys that know what's going on at this time, and they've got their radar on. And they also have a camera there. So they say, "Oh, we better start taking pictures of this thing." On training flights like this, the radar officer doesn't have much to do. So this is something important. So he starts taking radar pictures of this thing. Now the indication is it's running around over 1,000 miles an hour behind them. It's moving from one side of the aircraft to the other. The pilot can't see it because he's looking up front. They miss their landing. And the UFO apparently goes away. But then they come back for another try. And this time the pilot sees sees the aircraft. Now, the transcript of what's happening is being recorded in the tower, and that transcript is part of the file. So he's seeing a lighted object, which looks from the front, has some kind of a tunnel-like structure, and there's almost like an X, a forward cabin that's detached from the body of the UFO, but is connected by the tunnel. And it looks like an axe head, not an axe head, a Matic head. And there's light shining out of that. As they come close to it, the radio is interfered with. Now, the radar officer's back there still taking pictures. Now, this is a nuclear-capable aircraft. They got 2 radios. Everything is redundant on an aircraft that carries nuclear weapons. This is serious stuff. So they do all the anti-jamming stuff and all that. They're being jammed.
Yeah.
By this object. So they come around, and the object goes down and out of their sight, and then they come around and land. As they land, the instruction is the senior man will come to the operations area and fill out a report. Now, the pilot was not the senior man, so this check pilot was the one that went up there and filled this out. So, almost nobody knew about this case.
Yeah.
Until the pilot, the actual pilot, sent in a CUFOS report. I was so, since they cross out the names in Blue Book, when I looked in Blue Book, I assumed that the pilot, whose name was Runyon, that was his report. And when I showed it to him, he said, no, I didn't fill out anything like that. I filled out the thing that I sent to CUFOS. The Air Force never asked me to fill out a report. So the other pilot filled out a report. He's got the drawing in there just like the pilot described it, though.
There's an interesting anecdote to this case where one of the guys involved was a officer by the name of Joseph Capucci, and many years later, Joseph Capucci was actually a major general of the United States Air Force. He was actually head of the Defense Investigative Services. For the whole, so his office investigated security breaches within the Department of Defense and so on. And apparently into the 70s, he actually had an interest in UFOs. He was probably involved in the Robert Emenager affair with supposed Holloman Air Force Base UFO film footage and so on. So you got this out of the whole United States Air Force, which has got some million people or whatever. You've got this one officer, one very senior ranked officer in the 70s, who develops a UFO interest, and he happened to be there on the base during the 1968 Minot sighting. And we wonder if the interest in UFOs later on actually came from that. But yeah, that's a good case. And Chad, to answer your question, what constitutes as proof for me? In a case, right? Let's say you've got a case where any other explanations are even more ridiculous than a UFO. So say you've got a case where you look at it and you think, well, if it was a plane or a shooting star or something, that would be even more unlikely. It would be the most bizarre plane or shooting star in history than being a truly unknown object intelligently controlled from somewhere else. Like that's when you have a UFO case that's so compelling that it simply virtually can't be anything else. That's proof. Another piece of proof for me with documents and policy and plans within military and intelligence communities, when you've got say a commander or an entire department who's constantly telling you, no, we do not have this particular type of paperwork, no, we do not take these particular types of cases, no, our reporting system never deals with UFOs, and then years later you find you have them release documents that actually show that everything they said before was completely incorrect. So that to me is proof of a level of disinformation or cover-up or embarrassment or that. So I mean, there's different types of proof, but yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does. And I wanted to talk about an interesting topic, see if you all want to chime in on it. When I was studying the 1946 era, I came up with a topic that's about ghost rockets. It's a name given to mysterious rockets or missile-shaped objects, which were sighted on many different occasions between May and December of 1946, with peaks on the 9th and the 11th of August 1946. They were seen primarily in Sweden and nearby Scandinavian countries, but also in other European countries as well. Altogether, some 2,000 reported sightings were logged, 200 of them being on radar, and a number of fragments were reported and found by military authorities. If you don't know about that topic, what I did want to move on to is radar evidence.
Let me jump in here really quick, Chad, because while Jan and Paul were giving us some background on the Minot case, I came across Tom Tuline's article about the case, and just want to read a couple of points that Tom made. The radar scope photographs, and I've actually downloaded them and included them in the slideshow, so you can take a look at them. The radar scope photographs contain information to examine the nature of the UFO that is typically not available in the majority of UFO reports. And then he goes on and cites Dr. Claude Poher, who is a scientist and astronomer with basically the French version of NASA, CNES, and incorporating a multidisciplinary approach. Poher systematically formulates hypotheses leading to theoretical considerations concerning the energetic potential of the UFO. He suggests, for instance, that if it were possible for the UFO to sustain the inferred accelerations for more than a dozen hours, it could theoretically attain relativistic speeds approaching that of light, such that an interstellar voyage is possible. I didn't read that all that well, but basically we're talking about this UFO at Minot just kind of taking off at an extraordinary speed. Is that about right, everybody?
Yeah. He says later on in there that the amount of energy that it had to use was like multiple nuclear power plants. I think he says 147 in one place. He used the radar photographs, which are, to me, even better than the flare photographs from the Tic Tac and stuff. This is even more evidentiary than that material. 4 different experts analyzed the radar photographs outside the Air Force for us.
Okay, Jen, go ahead. Yeah. By all means.
I was going to say the thing that Tom and I were out doing a bunch of other interviews, and we stopped by Colonel Wayne Matson, and he's he was doing oral histories for excuse me for the Air and Space Museum in New Mexico, and we showed him those photographs. He had never seen them before, and he's looking at the photographs, and of course we already know what the other people said, Dr. Haynes and Polar and the other people. We already knew what they said, and he looks at the photographs and he says, "It's doing this here. It's moving across the back of the aircraft. It looks about the size of a C-47. It's going at over 1,000 miles an hour." I mean, he's just just confirming what the other people said. He had never seen the photographs before. He just, So the radar people came up that looked at this. The people who were experts on radar all came up with about the same thing. Just looking at the photographs, this is excellent evidence.
Okay, great. I wanted to actually bring up the ghost rocket topic because if there were a flurry or a wave of UFO sightings during that period of time, the descriptions here of what a ghost rocket allegedly is might account for those UFO sightings during 1946, specifically during the July period of time of 1946. Jan, I wanted to know, did you have any data on the ghost rockets that were, I guess that's probably an understatement, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an understatement. Of course, the Swedish archives are open to the guys in Sweden, AFU and UFO Sweden. They have all the official reports. They've also gone back and done newspaper research in the Swedish newspapers. Remember, Sweden wasn't involved in the war, so life went on in Sweden, and there's a lot of newspapers that they can look at for this. It's not like the rest of Europe that was pretty well destroyed.
Okay, so were there any reports of UFO activity at all?
Here's what I have.
Okay.
I went to the National Archives. I looked at Navy, Army, and Air Force messages, documents. Found over 100 documents from confidential to top secret. This is the most top secret documents that I've ever seen on UFO stuff. So we got over 100 of them. Those 100 documents refer to another 100 documents that we don't have yet. Every time I go to the archives, I find new documents on this. There's a report from the CIG to President Truman in there. In fact, there's 2 reports on ghost rockets. to the President of the United States from General Vandenberg, who at the time was the head of the CIG. It's a forerunner of the CIA. This is the most Navy documents that I've seen that are top secret involving aerial phenomena. Everybody in Europe is involved, just about. The embassy in London, the air attaché in London. He's not called he's called the air liaison officer. The naval attaché in London, and ghost rockets didn't stop in 46. They've gone on in like Klaus Swan tells us. When we interviewed him, he said, well, they went on to the 90s. He said since the Soviet Union fell, they're not as much as they used to be, but he said they never stopped. He said they really never stopped.
So, Jan, my question to you is then, were there any QFOS or any kind of UFO organization-related UFO reports that these ghost rockets can really account for those reports, possibly? In other words, these reports actually may have been based on a ghost rocket sighting. Is that possible?
Well, yeah. Some of these things are real interesting. In 1946, in the Swedish Defense Archives, these people report 3 triangular objects in formation flying overhead. When they go over the houses, the electricity is affected. The clocks are stopped, and the origin of the report is from the local police officers that went to investigate this. So Sweden had a UFO. And Sweden actually had a UFO investigation before Kenneth Arnold, because the ghost rockets, they had an investigation in Sweden, before Kenneth Arnold. That's where these thousands of reports are held. Besides that, Andrews Lilligen in Sweden, for my 1947 report, he wrote up a UFOs in Sweden in 1947. Of course, like I said, the ghost rockets just kept on going through 47. You didn't read much about it in the newspapers, but they just kept going, 47, 48, 49, 50. And like Kloss says, well, they never really stopped at all. So
okay, so Paul, what do you think? Are there any UFO sightings that could be accounted for by actual ghost rockets?
There'd probably be some. I mean, look, we don't have enough of say the Soviet Union's history in rocket design, rocket propulsion, test bedding of rockets and early unguided missiles, guided bombs, that sort of thing. We can't read Russian. We don't have access to Russian archives. There's been some great non-fiction books written, encyclopedic entries, documentaries on early like Russian or Soviet rocket development. But I mean, there would be some of those. There would be some in the Arctic and in Finland, and maybe even at the top of Norway and Sweden. There's going to be, or in the Baltic Sea region, the Black Sea, maybe the Mediterranean. There's going to be some examples of Russian long-range artillery shells and rocket barrages, which could account for some of these ghost rocket sightings. But I would say that only a small percentage would be. I mean, essentially these things are unsolved. Look, the ones that happened at night time, to me, not great, because they could easily have been just very, very, say, straight line, or very, very strong bollards like fireball re-entries and whatever. But the ones that happened during the day that were going at weird angles in around unpopulated areas where there's no military installations and where there's just farmland or whatever, they're the ones that confuse me. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Okay, great. And I wanted to actually, let me go ahead and preface my question with this comment first, and that is, you can't really talk about the topic of ufology in the 1940 era without bringing up the Battle of Los Angeles. So wanted to ask you guys about that, but let me go ahead and let our listeners know a little bit about that topic. And that happened in 24th February of 1942. Unidentified aerial objects triggered the firing of thousands of anti-aircraft rounds and raised the wartime alert status. The Battle of Los Angeles, also known as the Great Los Angeles Air Raid, is a name given by contemporary sources to the rumored attack by Japan and subsequent anti-aircraft artillery barrage, which took place from late February 24th to early February 25th of 1942 over Los Angeles, California, as you both know so well regarding that anecdotal story, and also based maybe partly on fact. I wanted to know, Jan and Paul, what do you think about that story? Is there any ET craft that could have been involved in that, or what is your take on that?
I'll start by saying that the vast majority of what you read online today and in books has been grossly exaggerated. It does not. I mean, some of the stats are real. Like, there really was anti-aircraft systems in Los Angeles. There really was that amount of fire at night. There were high levels involved. But the rest of it about UFOs or alien spacecraft, like being across the Pacific Ocean and into the suburbs of Los Angeles, being shot at violently, and then some sort of massive cover-up. It's been exaggerated. It's a lot of this stuff's been added in years later, completely added in. Jan, what do you think?
Well, it's like other UFO problems. There's official information that hasn't been released. I remember reading the chronology of the official chronology, not some writer's thing. It says the Navy gave the alert. I'm saying to myself, what does that mean? How did the Navy give the alert? Was there radar? I mean, there were Navy ships in the area. The Japanese had used some of their submarines to shell the shore installations around Los Angeles. They had been doing that for a couple of days beforehand. They did have planes that they could launch from submarines, but there's no evidence that occurred. They asked the Japanese afterwards if they had attacked Los Angeles, and the people that should know claim that they weren't involved in that.
So I'm just going
to... Los Angeles one, there's also a good possibility that part of the Los Angeles scenario was a weather balloon used to correct artillery firings that was launched just about the time the incident started. So there is... The thing about, to me, is the Navy gave the warning, and then the Navy disappears from the whole scenario. What the heck are you talking about? There's all kinds of missing information there. I've had several people look into it, as a matter of fact, and they quit right away. They say, this is too much. I say, well, go out and gather sightings, look in newspapers around the whole area, Los Angeles into Northern California. See if you can find things. And people have told me, this is too complicated. This is a pain in the neck. I'm not going to do it. And they send me what I have. So I've accumulated a lot of documents on this, but it's a super strange thing. Part of it is explainable. Part isn't. And there's just not enough official information released. Barry got a lot of official information on this, but it's just not enough.
Okay, so you asked about radar information. I know that you probably know what I'm talking about here, and you can go ahead and tell me whether you think it's false or not. But it says that on the 24th of February, a warning issued by Naval Intelligence indicated that an attack could be expected within the next 10 hours. That evening, a large number of flares and blinking lights were reported from the vicinity of defense plants. An alert called at 7:18 p.m. Pacific time was lifted, and the tension temporarily relaxed, which was it lifted hours later. But early in the morning of the 25th, renewed activity began. Radars. You asked about radar activity, which I know you probably know about what I'm talking about here, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Radars picked up an unidentified target 120 miles west of L.A. Anti-aircraft batteries were alerted and put on green alert, ready to fire a few minutes later. The AAF kept its pursuit planes on the ground, preferring to await indications of the scale and direction of any attack before committing its limited fighter force. Radars tracked the approaching target to within a few miles of the coast, and at 02:21, the regional controller ordered a blackout. Therefore, the info center was flooded with reports of enemy planes, even though the mysterious object tracked by radar in from sea seems to have vanished. Okay, so comments from you, Paul and Jan. Paul, do you have any comments on that?
No, look, I actually don't know that much about the case. It certainly is interesting. I mean, it's definitely, if that's if that's material that's absolutely penned at the time, written at the time, and not years later, that's very, very important narrative. Jan definitely knows more about this than I do.
Okay, Jan, your input?
Well, okay, that's not from an official document, I don't think.
No, you're right. It is not. You're absolutely correct on that. That is Wikipedia-based information.
So then I'd have to look at this. I have other things that NICAP, one of the guys at NICAP in the 60s was an air raid warden during that. And his testimony is in Gordon Denault's book, UFOs in Perspective. So he says he saw an actual object, and he was an air raid warden on the scene. I have a report from a guy that was on guard duty, and he saw a green fireball, and he didn't think it was a flare or a meteor. Just before the attack took place, or the incident took place. Let's put it that way. Now, officially, in the documents, there is the artillery did loose a balloon, and they were able to track it. So some of the artillery fire was actually mistakenly directed at the balloon. So we know that. But there's other things. That this thing is going up and down the interior of California, north and south. So this is interesting. Now, this is almost like a Roswell case, though. There's so much rumors around this case. There's supposedly crashed Air Force, Army Air Force planes that are seen later on by people. I can't confirm that. That's one of these rumors in the newspaper that one of these guys that did research for me out there found. So it's really difficult. There's got to be more official documents out there.
Okay, great.
More.
Thank you for that info.
Oh, and just let me jump in here really quick, Chant. You're mentioning of the radar target and all that. The source on that comes from two gentlemen, Frank Wesley Craven and James Lee Cate, West Coast Air Defenses and the Battle of Los Angeles, which is part of the Office of Air Force History. So that's the source on that as far as the radar target being picked up.
Thank you so much for that valuable information, Frank. Paul, I wanted to ask you, and also Jan, but I'd like Paul to actually respond first, if you don't mind. And that is, do you think the majority of the UFO-related reports or related any phenomena reported, also aside from UFO reports, for 1947 are explainable, or do they remain firmly unidentified? Paul.
I think that there's a big percentage that remain unidentified in that even the ones that have gone through rigorous investigation, there's a significant percentage that have eluded us completely. If you're talking about ones where they're simple, very, very tiny little newspaper articles or letters, belated letters 10 years, 20 years later, right, I'm not including those. And then cases of clear hoaxes, I'm not including those. So if you're looking at core, reasonable UFO reports, which have significant detail, I would say that a very significant percentage, I suppose I could say 40%, 35, something like that, 35, 40% have remained unidentified, that can't easily be explained away, that even the government at the time in, say, Project Sign or and other sort of like local army investigations or intelligence investigations within the Air Force or even the FBI couldn't solve at the time. So if they couldn't solve them then, they may not solve them now. So yeah, I'd say a significant percentage are unidentifiable.
Okay, and Jan, same question to you. Do you think the majority of the UFO reports for the 1947 era are explainable, or do they remain firmly unidentified? Jan?
Well, I think let's put it this way, a lot of 1947 reports are trivial. Now, there's almost 40 sightings from aircraft, and most of those are not trivial. And the UFOs do make unusual maneuvers. There's pacing aircraft, evading. There's a lot of things that are like that. There's radar cases in 47. You won't find them in Blue Book, but they're official radar cases in 47.
Yep.
And there's a lot of serious, good commentary by the witnesses reports that indicate that there's something. It's not aircraft. It's not astronomical. It's not balloons. 1947 was the biggest skywatch that ever happened. People would stay outside for hours and look at the sky, so they would see things that they had never seen before. Nobody had ever noticed, like, all the balloons that were going up, and a lot more balloons are going up for weather work in 47 than are doing it now because we have satellites and everything. So people had never noticed those things, would be seeing them. And there is a lot of trivial things, like Mrs. Johnson was riding back from grocery shopping and saw a flying saucer zip across the road about a mile up from her. And there's no information in there. To me, that's a trivial report that, and there's things that are even worse than that. Also, remember, it was a fad at the time. So I have some stuff about.
Okay, I think you're cutting out there a little bit, Jan, but thank you for that input. I wanted to talk about what might be considered radar evidence. Frank, you know a lot about this topic, a lot more than I do. Wanted to know, gentlemen, how do you feel about radar being used as proof or evidence regarding a possible UFO sighting? Any input on that, Frank? Jan?
Well, yeah, I'll jump in really quick and say it's excellent evidence. I mean, it's proof that when you've got radar evidence and visual to back it up, it's proof that something was there for sure, and radar is physical evidence.
Okay, Jan or Paul?
Yeah, radar is pretty good. Once the software, look, today it's all different because it's synthetic digital displays and so on, and if you're talking about just primary radar, primary echo radar, or tracking or scan radar, once an experienced radar operator, and even in the early days, the rudimentary software either wipes out or the operator can recognize things like electrical interference from other radio sources like trucks or whatever, can recognize temperature inversions, and particularly things like what we call running rabbits or whatever. Once that can be identified, and you've got when you've got cases where there's a solid object that's got a good return, then radar is reasonably good evidence. Where it can be really powerful is where you've got two completely different radar systems in the same area. So let's say you've got a track-while scan military radar, I don't know, in Oregon, and then you've got an airport with a RAPCON radar approach control radar on different frequencies with a different spinning head rate with completely different software. Let's say they both show the same thing. They both bases are talking to each other and saying, look, if you've got something in this sector at 16 degrees and altitude like this, and the other guy said, oh yeah, we've been watching this for 20 minutes, we don't know what it is. Well, we've got it too. Gee, it's getting big. Like that's significant evidence,
Okay, great. And I wanted to go ahead and let our listeners know that there's a website that's very, very important that they need to check out. It is called Project 1947. And how you get to it, and it is run by Jan Aldrich, by the way, it is www.project1947.com. And that is a worldwide effort to document the origins of the modern UFO phenomenon. And research for the project has yielded many early era UFO reports via the FOIA, newspaper articles, and contemporary accounts. Some of the material gathered by Project 1947 is displayed on that website. I think they update it on a regular. And Jan, this project that you've been working on so diligently for quite a while now, do you feel like this is a project that will never end?
I think it will never end. We constantly are finding new material, and sometimes it's got nothing to do with UFO researchers. The Marine Corps released some Korean War documents, and it was by the 1st Marine Air Wing in Korea at the time of the war, from 1951 to 1953, and it was weekly combat summaries, and they segregated, say, UFOs from unidentified aircraft or things like that. They actually had an entry on UFOs seen in Korea during the war, and that just came out because some Korean War vets that getting up there in age, they have been hounding the government to release some of these documents, and it wasn't UFO related that the inquiry. It was just vets doing that, and in the same way, the Vietnam War, some material at the archives about UFOs in Vietnam were just released because vets want to look at histories of their units and stuff, and there is material there. So
okay, and
this is never ending.
Right. Yes, and it's a labor of love. So I'm very glad that you're doing it, because what you're doing is you're doing a great big service to not just the UFO community but also the world. Paul, wanted to ask you, what role do you play in Project 1947? Can you be specific about that, please?
Oh, I don't do anything. Well, I can be specific, but I don't do anything specific with Jan. I mean, we just take on projects. So there's a lot of Australian stuff. Researcher Keith Basterfield and I will submit a heck of a lot. So for those that don't know, Jan's Project 1947 site, the actual web development, like a lot of the web work, like the uploads and downloads and so on, sometimes they're actually managed by a guy called John Stepkowski, and he actually lives in Australia, and he helps Jan a lot, and he has helped a lot over the years. And Keith Basterfield and I often submit things to John Stepkowski to upload onto the Project 1947 site to fill in blanks from Australia. So early letters between government agencies, and sometimes Keith and I do cold case investigations on very old cases that fills in blanks at Project 1947 sites. And like I say, there's all these unit histories and base histories that we're slowly going through. You know, Jan reads some, I read some. A lot of them have nothing in them, but a lot do, and we sort of coordinate like that. So yeah, but I mean, Project 1947 is an extremely significant site. It's just part of an overall history. There is other history projects too, like the Tom Talene oral history project work, where Tom Talene and others, maybe Brad Sparks at times or Jan, interview old rank officers or old sort of intelligence officials. That's another program. There's Fran Ridge's massive NICAP database. There's KUFOS with Mary Kastner and so on. You know, there's a lot of projects that all lead in and we help each other a lot, but it's insurmountable. I mean, the amount of stuff we're finding, even from, I mean, Jan can tell you from the Korean War, we're only just scratching the surface. It is unbelievable how much I think there was an Air Intelligence Service Squadron. I think it was the 5004th Air Intelligence Service Squadron in Korea, unless it was the 6004th. I'm not sure, but it was one in Korea that definitely dealt with UFO cases, and we've got scarcely a single page about it. There could be thousands of pages out there, classified secret, maybe even top secret, sitting in archives and sitting at Maxwell Air Force Base. So this is what we do, you know. Like it's very slow though, dealing with government agencies and archives, and dealing physically with paperwork and clunky CDs and keyword searches that don't work very well, and we're trying to bounce around the world. We've got time zone problems, technology problems. It's very, very hard at times.
You know, the light. Go ahead, Jan, please.
Yeah, we have this really small group. It's about 6 people right now. Paul's part of it. It's called UFOs and Governments. Governments.
Yep.
Not the inspiration was UFOs and Government, the book that we wrote. But Paul is part of this UFOs and Governments, and that's what we're doing. We're looking for government things, and we found something real interesting. A low-level case in, of all places, the middle of Africa in 1952 in an official government. South Rhodesian government document. That's that's the kind of stuff we're looking for. And of course, as my site, you might as well call it the Keith Basterfield UFO research site, because he has so much material up there. He's pushing me out.
Okay, I wanted to talk about, and then we'll wrap it up, real briefly about what it means to be a researcher. I just want to talk about a very simple concept, but I'd like to go ahead and give the definition for it. It's something that Jan and Paul live out probably 24/7, and that is what is research? What does that mean? Well, it's a careful and detailed study into specific problem or problems, concern, or issues using the scientific method. Or methods that you all have come to use, that you're used to as a system. And that's best accomplished by turning an issue into a question, according to this definition, with the intent of research to answer the question, whatever the question or series of questions are. And some of the skill sets that a researcher would need are an analytical mind, the ability to stay calm, which might be laughable to both of you, because I'm sure you pull your hair out sometimes trying to get some of this data compiled, collated, and together. Curiosity, quick thinker, commitment, excellent written and verbal communication skills. I do have an issue with that regarding excellent written or verbal communication skills, because I have met some absolutely astounding researchers just like yourselves, and they cannot communicate well verbally. They do not have social skill sets that really can be used very well, and their written skills are pretty miserable, but they are amazing and astounding researchers. Anyway, wanted to ask you, what are the characteristics do you both think of being a good researcher? What has worked for you regarding being able to research the topic of ufology and other phenomena and other subjects like history, for example? Paul or Jan?
Jan?
Okay, so I'm a plotter. I plod along. I'm not the deep thinker type. If I go to the archives, what I'm doing is I am looking for likely areas which will produce results. Now, let me tell you, it's like drilling for oil. You get a bunch of dry holes. And in some cases, like I got out all the released top secret documents from 1946 up to 1952, which is the only stuff that was available at the time. And I turned every top secret document over page by page. That's how I found stuff about ghost rockets, Foo Fighters, UFOs that aren't in Blue Book or other places. So a lot of research is just the kind of things that I'm doing, plotting. Mr. Lewis at the National Archives told Robert Todd, the father of all FOIA guys, that he and his staff are too small to dig out every UFO reference that's at the National Archives. And so, but he says there's plenty of stuff here. You've got to come and look at it. I have 11,000 intelligence documents that I want to look at. In that, there's a subset of what I know is about 1,000 UFO cases, most of them are not in Blue Book.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that gives you an idea. I have a database with about 800 cases, but I've got notes around here for a lot more. This is just government documents on UFOs which are not in Blue Book or what we've found so far.
Yeah.
But I have 11,000 that I want to look at that might have something. But I know
and Jan's probably talking about like some of those. We've got Jan's found that the Navy, like the United States Navy in the 40s and 50s, had unidentified phenomena, sonar and radar targets. They were dealing with sort of like stray or incoming or unusual aircraft cases. None of this stuff got to Project Sign, or not much of it got to Project Sign or Project or Project Blue Book. It went through Office of Naval Intelligence. Some of it went straight to the base where the ship was, or the ships were based, or they were dealt with in short order in, say, the Mediterranean or the North Atlantic or whatever, or the cases essentially stayed on the ships. An internal telex was printed, and that was it. There will be the US Navy. I wouldn't be surprised if they nearly have as much UFO paperwork as what the Air Force ever produced. And this isn't, I mean, then imagine the Army and then the Air National Guards and the Army National Guards. It's just insurmountable, you know?
Okay, so Paul, what constitutes being a good researcher to you? If you could keep that little short, and then I just have one last question for both of you, and that would be it.
Okay, don't throw things out. Archive things. Keep things in good order. File things with proper dates and titles. Keep quality. Try and keep quality material. Always be on the search. If you've got a document or a newspaper article or a magazine article that's barely legible, black and white, upside down, whatever, try and get a better copy. So that's being a true archivist. That's important. Another thing is to sort of try and get the opinions of other people. If possible, don't form opinions just with one sole track mind, whether you're a skeptic or otherwise, or a pro UFO researcher on the fence. Try and bring in the odd opinion of a meteorologist or a historian or a handwriting expert or a person who interrogates people. Try and get some sort of opinion of a person who's built radars before or taken them apart or whatever, like that to me is quite important. Yeah.
Wanted to talk to the listeners real fast about something that happened when I was talking to Paul. I noticed there was a bundle of paper next to him, and he picked it up. It was 3 bundles or more, and they were basically FOIAs that he had asked for, and he had gotten a response on. You just know, folks out there, if you end up becoming a researcher, you will end up with a lot of paper. There's a lot of data. You can have mountains and mountains of data. And right, Paul? Isn't that correct?
Absolutely huge. Now, both, you're going to need an external hard drive. You're going to need a backup of that in case it blows up. You're going to have a printer. You're going to have a scanner. I've actually submitted 3 FOI requests to the Australian Department of Defence in the last 2 weeks. And I know that, each FOI request is 2 pages. Their replies are going to be a page. I print them out. Then they've got a substantive reply telling me what they've found and how much it's going to cost, if it costs anything at all. So that's another 2 pages. Then there's the legal stuff. That's another 2 pages. Then there's the covering emails. That's a page each. So, and this is before any documents are released at all. Like not even close to that yet.
And that's if they respond back.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We're in Australia. We're lucky. They absolutely do. America's got the problem with that. America's agencies and commands are just terrible. The CIA is very bad now. The Department of Air Force headquarters is very, very bad. The Navy's, the Office of Naval Intelligence and Sea Surface Systems Command, they're all very poor now. Some US agencies are good. US Strategic Command's been very good to me. Northern Command's been very good to me. Who else? Air Force Space Command's not bad, and the 14th Air Force. But Jan will tell you that particularly the Navy, for example, is very hard to deal with. We don't have that problem here. You have it there. England's good. New Zealand's very good because it's such a small country. They're just not dealing with that much. But the United States is definitely the worst of all of them.
USA.
Yeah, it's terrible. You're right. There are some pretty terrible waiting times regarding FOIA requests. There was a 25-year-old FOIA requests that were confirmed that those delays still continue. And that article, if you look it up, you just can type in the keywords I typed in, which was FOIA request delays. But anyway, wanted to ask Jan and you one last question. And that is, what is your takeaway? Let's just pretend, you had to sum up everything that you have learned from being a researcher regarding the UFO topic. Jan and Paul, what is your takeaway from having spent so many decades and so much copious amount of time studying and researching, collating and organizing, and actually accumulating mountains of data on the UFO topic? What is your takeaway from it?
But to me, that it's incredibly complex. And the average person would be absolutely astounded if they knew how much material was out there, and not even reactionary material like tabloid magazines and junk newspaper articles and junk documentaries. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about core information, original interviews, photographs, whatever. That the average person would be astounded by both how rich this is and how complex it is. That's what my thing is.
Okay, Jan, what's your input on that?
I started being interested in junior high, so that's more than 50 years ago. I was a babe in the woods then, and I'm a babe in the woods now. Ted Blocher said in an interview we did with him, he said, "You know what? I've come full circle after about 3 decades. I'm right where I was when I began. I don't."
Yeah.
And we've heard that, by the way. Frank and I have heard that when we've done panels, when we've asked people, what is your major takeaway? We've actually had people tell us after decades of doing research that they actually have determined they still don't know anything.
Exactly. There's an old anecdote. I think Jacques Vallée said this. He essentially said that really I don't know what year he said. I think it was possibly 1970. He said that, maybe because of the end of Blue Book and the Condon Report. But he said that we've learned so much, but we've actually learned so little. So
then the last question. Go ahead. Yes, please go on.
So what he's basically saying is that we're not that much further ahead than what we are saying in 1970. That's what he's basically saying.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead, Jan.
One more thing. I'm dealing with a retired Air Force pilot who is super knowledgeable on everything with aviation, and he's a physicist, and his specialty is other planets' atmosphere. And he said, "You know what? I think that UFOs are finally getting some scientific recognition." He says, "I think we can think we're on the verge of some scientific recognition. I hope so."
Okay, yeah. So then if we've come full circle and we really are back where we started, what is the point? What is the point of doing research then, Jan and Paul? That's my last question.
Because it's going to encourage scientists and technical people with far more skills than what we have to take the subject seriously. I mean, there were scientists in the past. We just don't have, well, not publicly anyway, we just don't have a James McDonald and a Joseph Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée and the early, like the Thornton Page and early technical specialists and policymakers and scientists and experts. We just don't have the numbers that we used to have that would spend months at a time on the subject. And the more we research, the more we generate original quality material for people to look at well into the future, right? That's something that should happen and eventually will. I'm sure of that.
Jan, what is the point?
2 things. Completing the record, and that I'm mostly interested in UFO history, so I can study actual things like people and organizations and how they react to UFOs. And of course, we wrote UFOs in Government, which is in many universities all across the world now. The other thing is, I do something that's called filling in the gaps. I try to find more about old cases and also other UFOs in older eras, and I'm constantly surprised about what we find. So,
okay, yeah.
That is what I can say on that.
Thank you so much, Jan and Paul, for having been on our show today. Jan, we really appreciate everything that you are doing for the UFO community and also just for everybody on the planet. There's folks on the other side of the planet that are reading the material you put on your website, project1947.com, and I'm sure it inspires them to learn more about this topic, the UFO phenomena, which is an enigmatic one and one that's just as mysterious as many other topics that we cover. Paul, thank you very much for everything you've done for the UFO community. We're really glad that we were able to have you on the show. And Jan and Paul, we look forward to having you on more shows in the future. Frank, do you have any last words?
Yeah, just to cite an incident involving John Mack. He was involved a little bit more in the contactee abductee thing. But when he undertook his research, he contacted a fellow that he knew at Harvard by the name of Thomas Kuhn, who had written a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Kuhn's advice to Mac was just keep gathering data. You want to gain knowledge about the subject. You find it interesting. Just keep gathering data, and that's really what we're here for. To keep gathering data, gather it, share it, and let the chips fall where they may. So that's that.
Yeah, Kuhn is an interesting character. He was in the OSS, and he was interested in UFOs.
Yeah, OSS is the CIA before it was the CIA. Office of Strategic. It's an Office of Strategic Services. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Kuhn was in there. They just dumped him in North Africa and said, "Disrupt the enemy." That was his mission.
That's a bit vague.
Well, I think he gave Max some pretty good advice, though. You know, we're all interested in this subject.
Yeah, but I want to emphasize that he was knowledgeable on UFOs too.
Got it. Yeah, I was not aware of that. I was Mac did not mention that in the interview where he mentioned seeking Kuhn's advice before he undertook the abductee research. So let's wrap everything up. Jan and Paul, thanks so much for taking Jan, your Sunday, and Paul, your early Monday for joining us. Great show, and we're going to be back Tuesday. Jan, you want to tell the folks who we're going to have on Tuesday night, East Coast time?
Yeah, I'd like to keep that a secret for now.
Okay, all right.
That's a pretty well-known person, but anyway, I wanted to also encourage our listeners to please contribute to Project 1947 if you can. Now, just as far as information goes, there's a part of the website where you can actually lend whatever help you can to them by contacting Project 1947, which would be Jan Aldrich. And also, Jan, if people want to contribute monetarily to that project, how do they do that?
Okay, I don't have a PayPal. I'm trying to give back. You know, I started out with a pretty good starting fee, so I've tried to keep everything for free. But we could use money, and the postal address is P.O. Box 391, Canterbury, Connecticut 06331.
If you wouldn't mind repeating that again, that way folks can get that information down. Go ahead.
It's Project 1947 at P.O. Box 391, Canterbury, Connecticut 06331.
Okay, great. And they can also go to project1947.com to reach out to you and hit contact so that they can actually communicate with you that way. Is that right?
Yes. And we've gotten a lot of UFO reports by that. and many of them very serious and very, very good, and I really appreciate that.
Yes, so Project 1947 staff continues to welcome further contributions monetarily. If there's any to be had, please do send them their way, because they work for nothing. And this is all voluntary, this project. This is not a for-profit project, obviously. And also, if you have any information that you can share regarding that era of time, it's vitally important you contact Jan and let him have the information that he can share to add to that website. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for having been on our show today. We look forward to having you on the show again this year. Actually, it would be next year, because we're just a few weeks shy of 2020.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jan and Paul. And everybody, thanks for listening. You have enjoyed the rest of your weekend, and we will see you on Tuesday with a special surprise guest. Thank you very much.
It's a famous guest. He's known worldwide, so I look forward to that show. And thank you. I want to thank Jan and Paul for having had the privilege and honor of interviewing today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye-bye.